3 weeks after my wife Rachel packed her designer suitcases and delivered her parting shot about how I'd never find anyone better, her sister forwarded me a screenshot that made me spit coffee across my kitchen table. Rachel had apparently discovered my dating profile, and according to the frantic text chain between her and her sister, she was absolutely losing her mind. The woman who'd spent our final argument listing my inadequacies like reading from a performance review had just realized that 47 different women in our city apparently disagreed with her assessment. I'm David, I'm 35, and this is the story of how my supposedly hopeless romantic future became my ex-wife's worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel and I had been married for 6 years when the cracks started showing. Looking back, the signs were scattered across those years like breadcrumbs I was too busy to notice. She'd grown increasingly critical, not just of the small stuff like leaving dishes in the sink or forgetting to replace the toilet paper, but of fundamental parts of who I was. My job as a software engineer wasn't prestigious enough for her social circle. My preference for quiet weekends at home instead of expensive brunches with her friends made me antisocial. The way I dressed was too casual, my haircut too conservative, my hobbies too boring. The complaints came wrapped in concern, which made them harder to recognize as attacks. She'd tell me she was just trying to help me become the best version of myself. When I'd push back or defend myself, she'd accuse me of being defensive and unwilling to grow. It was a perfect trap. Agree with her assessment of my flaws, or prove her point about my inability to accept feedback. For years, I chose the first option, thinking that's what good husbands did. Our house in Riverside Heights had become a museum of her taste. Every piece of furniture, every decorative accent, every paint color reflected her vision of how successful people lived. I'd contributed the mortgage payments and lost every discussion about aesthetics. My home office was the only space that felt like mine, filled with my computer setup, my books on programming languages, and a few framed photos from college that she'd tried multiple times to relocate to less prominent locations. The erosion happened gradually, the way a river changes the shape of rocks without anyone noticing day by day. I stopped suggesting restaurants I liked because she'd find reasons they weren't suitable. I quit bringing up movies I wanted to see, because they were always too lowbrow, or too violent, or too something. I learned to anticipate her objections to my suggestions and eventually stopped making suggestions at all. It was easier to let her decide everything and focus on my work, where I still felt competent and valued. My job at TechFlow Solutions was one of the few areas of my life where Rachel's criticism couldn't reach me. I was a senior developer with a strong reputation, leading projects that mattered, mentoring junior developers, and earning respect from my peers. My manager, Carlos, had hinted multiple times about management opportunities, but Rachel had convinced me I wasn't leadership material. According to her, I was too introverted, too technical-minded, too focused on details to see the big picture that executive roles required. The beginning of the end started with a conversation about our future that turned into an argument about my limitations. Rachel had spent the afternoon with her friend Melissa, whose husband had just been promoted to vice president at his marketing firm. She came home energized by stories of Melissa's new luxury SUV, their plans to renovate their kitchen, and a vacation to Tuscany they were booking for the fall. She found me in the living room, reading a technical manual for a new framework I was learning, and the sight of me with a book instead of plotting our ascent to her friend's lifestyle triggered something in her. She asked why I never showed ambition beyond my current role, why I seemed content to let other men pass me by, while I played with computers in the corner of our house like a teenager who never grew up. When I tried to explain that I found fulfillment in mastering my craft, and that financial success wasn't the only measure of a meaningful life, she rolled her eyes with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a willfully ignorant child. She said I was making excuses for being afraid to compete at higher levels, that I was hiding behind philosophy because I lacked the drive to succeed in the real world. The argument escalated when I pointed out that my salary was actually quite good, that we lived comfortably, that we had savings and security that many couples would envy. This seemed to anger her more, not less. She said comfort was the enemy of excellence, that I was wasting my potential, that she'd married me because she saw something in me that I apparently refused to see in myself. Then came the line that should have been my warning. She said if I wasn't going to grow into the man she'd married, maybe she'd married the wrong man. At the time I thought she was just frustrated, just pushing me toward goals that would make us both happier. I promised to think about pursuing management opportunities, to be more social with her friends, to take her concerns seriously. What I didn't understand was that she'd already started thinking about exit strategies. The criticism wasn't meant to improve our marriage. It was meant to justify ending it. The final months of our marriage followed a pattern I couldn't see while I was living through it. Rachel would pick a fight about some aspect of my personality or behavior. I would apologize and promise to change. She would seem satisfied for a few days, then the cycle would repeat with a new target. My communication style, my lack of spontaneity, my preference for routine, my insufficient appreciation for her efforts to elevate our social status. She started working late more often, joining a yoga class that met 3 evenings a week, and scheduling frequent coffee dates with friends I'd never met. When I'd ask about her day, her responses became shorter, more generic. When I'd suggest we spend an evening together, she'd remind me of all the things I needed to work on before she could enjoy my company. The distance between us grew measurable. We stopped sharing meals regularly. Our conversations became functional exchanges about schedules and responsibilities. Physical intimacy disappeared completely, not gradually but suddenly, like a switch had been flipped. When I'd try to initiate conversations about what was happening to us, she'd turn the focus back to my failings, my inability to create the emotional connection she needed. I started working longer hours, partly because work felt safer than home, and partly because she'd convinced me that career advancement might save our marriage. I took on extra projects, volunteered for leadership responsibilities, and began studying for management certifications. The irony was that the more I tried to become the ambitious man she said she wanted, the more absent I became from the relationship she said I was neglecting. Carlos noticed the change in my work patterns and asked if everything was okay at home. I gave him the standard response about marriage requiring balance and compromise, but he'd been married for 15 years and recognized the signs of a man trying to fix his personal life through professional achievement. He suggested I take some vacation time, maybe focus on whatever was happening outside the office. I should have listened to him. Instead, I doubled down on the belief that if I could just become successful enough, ambitious enough, social enough, Rachel would remember why she'd married me. I signed up for networking events, bought new clothes that fit her idea of how successful men dressed, and started reading business books instead of technical manuals. None of it mattered. By the time I realized what was happening, she'd already made her decision. The conversation that ended our marriage has lasted less than 10 minutes. She'd arranged it like a business meeting, waiting until after dinner on a Sunday evening when we were both fed and calm. She sat across from me at our dining room table, hands folded, expression composed, and announced that she'd done a lot of thinking and decided she needed space to figure out what she wanted from her life. When I asked if she meant a separation, she said she meant a divorce. When I asked if we could try counseling first, she said she'd already been seeing a therapist individually and had concluded that our fundamental incompatibilities couldn't be resolved through compromise. When I asked what specifically I could change, she said the problem wasn't any single behavior, but rather who I was at my core. She'd prepared answers for all my questions, responses that sounded reasonable and final. She wanted to divide our assets fairly. She didn't want to fight or assign blame. She hoped we could remain civil throughout the process. She'd already consulted with an attorney to understand her rights and responsibilities. The clinical precision of it stunned me more than the content. This wasn't an emotional breakdown or a moment of frustration. This was a project she'd been managing, a problem she'd been solving, a decision she'd already implemented in everything but the legal paperwork. When I asked if there was someone else, she looked genuinely offended. She said she wasn't the kind of person who cheated, that she had too much integrity for that. She was simply honest enough to admit when something wasn't working instead of wasting both our lives pretending otherwise. That night, she moved into our guest bedroom. Within a week, she'd found a furnished apartment across town. Within 2 weeks, she'd hired movers to collect her belongings. I came home from work one Thursday to find half our furniture missing, and a note on the kitchen counter explaining which items she'd taken and which she'd left for me. The note was organized into categories: kitchen equipment, living room furniture, bedroom items, decorative accessories. She'd been methodical about dividing our possessions, taking approximately half the value while leaving me with the items that best suited my supposed preferences. I kept the practical furniture, the basic appliances, the electronics. She took the pieces with style, the artwork, the items that made a house look like a home, instead of a place where someone slept between work shifts. Standing in that half-empty house, I felt like I was seeing our marriage clearly for the first time. She hadn't just been dissatisfied with me. She'd been cataloging our possessions, planning her exit, building a new life in her mind, while still sharing a bed with me. The criticism, the distance, the fights about my potential had all been components of a strategy I'd been too trusting to recognize. That Friday evening, as I sat in my mostly empty living room eating takeout Chinese food from the container, she called to check on how I was handling the transition. Her voice carried the careful concern of someone fulfilling an obligation. She asked if I needed anything, if I had questions about the divorce process, if I was taking care of myself. Then, as the conversation was winding down, she delivered the line that would echo in my head for weeks. She said she hoped I'd eventually understand that she was doing both of us a favor, that I deserved to be with someone who appreciated me exactly as I was instead of trying to change me. But she also hoped I was realistic about my prospects, because the dating world had changed a lot since we'd gotten together, and men like me might find it challenging to connect with women who had options. She said this in the same tone she'd used to discuss dividing the silverware, as if she were sharing practical information rather than delivering a final insult. The subtext was clear. I was damaged goods, a discount item that had been marked down for obvious flaws, and I should be grateful if anyone was willing to accept the bargain. After she hung up, I walked through my empty house and tried to imagine what she'd seen when she looked at me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A 35-year-old man with a stable but unspectacular career, average looks, introverted personality, and no apparent potential for the kind of growth that would impress her friends. A safe choice that had turned out to be a disappointing investment. For the first time in years, I felt angry instead of apologetic. Not just at Rachel, but at myself for accepting her assessment of my worth, for letting her rewrite my understanding of who I was and what I had to offer. I'd spent so much energy trying to become the man she wanted that I'd forgotten the man I'd been before she started her improvement project. The next morning, I called Carlos and asked if that management position he'd mentioned was still available. When he said yes, I told him I was interested. When he asked what had changed, I said I was ready to stop underestimating myself. That conversation was the first step toward reclaiming my life, though I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was just trying to prove Rachel wrong about my potential. What I discovered was something much more valuable. I was remembering who I'd been before she'd convinced me I wasn't enough. The divorce proceedings moved with the same efficiency Rachel had brought to dismantling our household. She'd chosen an attorney who specialized in uncontested divorces, someone who could expedite the process without unnecessary drama. Since we had no children and had kept our finances relatively separate, the legal mechanics were straightforward. We met twice with our respective lawyers to finalize the division of assets and debts. Rachel was fair in her financial calculations, taking responsibility for her student loans and credit card balances while ensuring I kept the retirement accounts I'd funded mostly with my own contributions. She signed away any claim to my stock options, which she'd always dismissed as imaginary money anyway. During those meetings, she maintained the same professional courtesy she'd use with a coworker she didn't particularly like, but needed to collaborate with. She was punctual, prepared, and focused on completing the necessary tasks efficiently. She asked about my health insurance options and reminded me to update my emergency contacts at work. She offered to coordinate with utility companies to transfer accounts. Her attorney complimented her on being one of the most reasonable clients she'd worked with, someone who understood that divorce was a business transaction rather than an emotional battleground. Rachel smiled at the praise with the satisfaction of someone who prided herself on handling difficult situations with grace. What struck me during those meetings was how completely she'd already moved on. She referenced her new apartment, her new routines, her plans for redecorating, as if our 6-year marriage had been a temporary housing situation that had simply reached its natural conclusion. She spoke about our shared past in past tense, like describing a job she'd held earlier in her career. When the papers were finalized and we walked out of the law office for the final time, she paused on the sidewalk and delivered what I realized later was her closing statement. She said she hoped I'd learned something about myself through our marriage, that I'd use the experience to become a better partner for whoever came next. But she also hoped I'd be realistic about the dating market, because women today had high standards and numerous options. She said this with what seemed like genuine concern for my welfare, as if she were a career counselor preparing me for a job search in a competitive field. She mentioned that dating apps could be brutal for men who weren't exceptionally attractive or charismatic, that I should probably focus on meeting people through shared activities where my personality could compensate for my other limitations. The advice felt like a final gift wrapped in condescension. She was generously sharing her wisdom about my romantic prospects, while simultaneously ensuring I understood those prospects were limited. It was Rachel being helpful in exactly the way that made her feel generous, while making me feel grateful for her honesty about my deficiencies. I thanked her for the advice and wished her luck with her new life. We shook hands like business associates concluding a project, and then we walked to our separate cars and drove away in different directions. That evening, I sat in my quiet house and tried to imagine the dating life she'd described. Apps that would showcase my limitations, competitions where I'd struggle to stand out, women who would see me as a consolation prize rather than a catch. For a moment, I felt the familiar weight of inadequacy she'd trained me to carry. Then I remembered something Carlos had said when I'd started pursuing the management role. He'd told me that confidence was like a muscle that got stronger with use, but also weaker with disuse. Rachel had spent years encouraging me to let that muscle atrophy. Maybe it was time to start exercising it again. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and tried to see what someone else might see, someone who didn't know Rachel's list of my shortcomings. I saw a reasonably fit man with intelligent eyes and a kind expression. I saw someone who'd been successful in his career, who'd been a loyal husband, who'd tried to make his marriage work even when it was failing. I saw someone who deserved better than the resignation Rachel had prescribed for his future. That afternoon, I downloaded 3 different dating apps. Creating a dating profile felt like writing a resume for a job I'd never applied for before. I stared at the blank template on my phone screen for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to summarize myself in a way that would attract someone without sounding desperate or delusional. Rachel's voice echoed in my head, reminding me about realistic expectations and limited options. My first attempt was brutally honest to the point of self-sabotage. Recently divorced software engineer seeks companionship, enjoys quiet evenings and technical documentaries, not particularly outgoing but loyal and financially stable. I deleted that after reading it back and realizing it sounded like a classified ad for a reliable used car. My second attempt tried to channel the confidence I'd been rebuilding at work. Senior developer, and emerging, looking for genuine connection with someone who appreciates intelligence, loyalty, and dry humor. Interests include hiking, craft beer, and solving complex problems. That felt better, though I worried I was overselling myself. Choosing photos proved even more challenging. I had exactly 3 pictures of myself that weren't wedding photos or group shots where Rachel had cropped herself out. One was a professional headshot from our company website that made me look competent but sterile. Another was a casual photo my brother had taken during a fishing trip, where I looked relaxed and genuinely happy. The third was a mirror selfie I'd taken while trying on new clothes, which felt too desperate but showed that I understood modern dating required visual proof of my existence. I spent an entire evening crafting and recrafting my profile, second-guessing every word choice and photo selection. The apps made the process feel like a video game where I didn't understand the rules. There were algorithms to consider, keywords to optimize, strategies for standing out among thousands of other profiles. Forums dedicated to dating app success were filled with men sharing tactics and statistics like they were preparing for military campaigns. When I finally published my profile on 3 different platforms, I felt the same mixture of excitement and terror I'd experienced on my first day at TechFlow Solutions. I was putting myself out there for evaluation and potential rejection, but also opening myself to possibilities I couldn't predict or control. The first few days were humbling in exactly the way Rachel had warned me they would be. I received a handful of matches, mostly from women whose profiles suggested they were casting wide nets rather than showing specific interest in mine. Our conversations were polite but generic, the kind of small talk that dies natural deaths when neither person feels compelled to keep it alive. I started to wonder if Rachel had been right about my prospects. Maybe 6 years of marriage had left me unprepared for a dating landscape that rewarded quick wit and instant chemistry. Maybe my personality worked better in long-term relationships where people had time to appreciate my steadier qualities. Then something unexpected happened. A woman named Sarah, who worked as a veterinarian and had written a genuinely funny profile about her patients being better conversationalists than most humans, sent me a message that referenced something specific from my profile. She'd noticed that I mentioned enjoying problem solving and asked if that extended to helping animals who couldn't explain what was wrong with them. Our conversation developed naturally over several days. She was intelligent without being pretentious, funny without being cruel, and genuinely curious about my work in ways that didn't feel like job interview questions. When I explained a particularly complex project I was leading, she asked thoughtful follow-up questions that showed she was actually listening, rather than waiting for her turn to talk. We moved from the app to text messaging, then to phone calls that lasted hours without feeling forced. She had her own career challenges and ambitions, her own perspectives on relationships and personal growth, her own life that didn't require me to fill gaps or solve problems. Talking to her reminded me what it felt like to be appreciated for who I was, rather than criticized for who I wasn't. When we finally met for coffee, the conversation flowed as easily in person as it had over the phone. She was prettier than her photos suggested, but more importantly, she was present in a way that made me feel present too. We talked for 3 hours without checking our phones or watching the clock, covering everything from career goals to childhood memories, to opinions about whether artificial intelligence would eventually make my job obsolete. At the end of our first date, she suggested we do it again soon. Not out of politeness, but with genuine enthusiasm that caught me off guard. As I walked to my car, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt desired, not just tolerated. Sarah and I had been dating for 2 weeks when other matches started appearing more frequently. Women who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, who responded thoughtfully to my messages, who suggested meeting in person instead of letting conversations fade into digital obscurity. Each interaction boosted my confidence in ways I hadn't expected. There was Jennifer, a high school English teacher who shared my appreciation for quiet weekends and intellectual conversations. She sent me articles she thought I'd find interesting and asked for book recommendations based on authors I'd mentioned enjoying. Our text exchanges felt like correspondence between friends who happened to be exploring romantic compatibility. Then there was Monica, a marketing executive who appreciated my technical expertise and asked for advice about software solutions for her company. She was more outgoing than my usual type, but she seemed to find my introverted nature calming rather than boring. When she invited me to a networking event her company was hosting, I surprised myself by accepting. The networking event was exactly the kind of social gathering Rachel had always insisted I needed to attend more often, filled with ambitious professionals making connections and advancing their careers. But instead of feeling out of place, I found myself having engaging conversations about technology trends and business. Monica introduced me to her colleagues as someone whose insights they should value, not someone she was trying to help overcome his limitations. Over the following weeks, my dating app experience transformed from a desperate attempt to prove Rachel wrong into something that actually brought joy to my daily routine. I was talking to intelligent, accomplished women who seemed to appreciate my sense of humor, my stability, my willingness to listen, and my perspective on various topics. The more successful interactions I had, the more I realized how systematically Rachel had undermined my confidence. She'd convinced me that my introverted nature was a social liability, but several women mentioned that they found my thoughtful communication style refreshing compared to men who dominated conversations. She'd told me my career lacked ambition, but multiple matches seemed impressed by my expertise and leadership responsibilities. Most surprisingly, women consistently complimented aspects of my personality that Rachel had identified as problems. My tendency to think before speaking, which she'd called indecisive, was described as thoughtful by women who were tired of impulsive men. My preference for deep conversations over small talk, which she'd labeled antisocial, was appreciated by women seeking meaningful connections. I started to understand that Rachel's assessment of my romantic value had been distorted by her own dissatisfaction with our relationship. She'd projected her disappointment onto my character rather than acknowledging that we simply weren't compatible. Her predictions about my dating struggles said more about her limited perspective than my actual appeal to other women. The shift in my self-perception was gradual, but profound. Instead of apologizing for my introverted nature, I started describing it as selective social engagement. Instead of downplaying my technical expertise, I talked about it as specialized knowledge that solved real problems. Instead of accepting that I was boring, I recognized that I was selective about how I spent my time and energy. My success on the dating apps created a feedback loop that improved every aspect of my social interactions. The more positive responses I received, the more confident I became in my communications. The more confident I became, the more attractive my profiles and messages became to potential matches. What had started as an attempt to prove Rachel wrong had evolved into a genuine rediscovery of my own worth. By the end of my first month on the apps, I was juggling more interesting conversations than I could reasonably maintain. I had scheduled dates with 3 different women for the upcoming weekend, coffee with one, lunch with another, and dinner with a third. For someone who Rachel had warned might struggle to find any matches, I was facing the pleasant problem of having too many options. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man she'd described as romantically hopeless was apparently quite appealing to women who didn't share her specific preferences and prejudices. The personality traits she'd tried to change were exactly the qualities other women found attractive. The ambition she'd demanded I develop was less important to most matches than the stability and emotional intelligence I'd always possessed. I found myself wondering what Rachel would think if she knew how well I was doing, but I pushed those thoughts aside. My dating success wasn't about proving anything to her. It was about discovering what I had to offer and finding people who appreciated those qualities. The best revenge against someone who underestimated you isn't proving them wrong, but building a life so fulfilling that their opinion becomes irrelevant. At work, my colleagues started noticing changes in my demeanor. Carlos mentioned that I seemed more confident in team meetings, more willing to share my opinions and challenge ideas that didn't make sense. The junior developers I mentored told me I seemed more approachable, more willing to share personal experiences alongside technical knowledge. The management training program I'd enrolled in felt less like an attempt to transform myself and more like a natural extension of capabilities I'd always possessed. I was learning to articulate my value more clearly, to advocate for my ideas more effectively, to lead by example rather than trying to become someone entirely different. When the promotion to senior engineering manager was officially offered 3 weeks later, I accepted it with the confidence of someone who deserved the opportunity, rather than the gratitude of someone who'd been given a chance despite obvious limitations. The salary increase was substantial enough to afford a house upgrade, travel opportunities, and other lifestyle improvements that would have impressed even Rachel's status-conscious friends. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the recognition that I'd been undervaluing myself for years, accepting other people's assessments of my potential instead of developing my own understanding of my capabilities. Rachel had convinced me that I needed to change fundamental aspects of my personality to become worthy of success and love. What I was discovering was that I needed to change my willingness to accept other people's limitations as facts about myself. The dating apps had become a laboratory for experimenting with self-presentation and discovering which aspects of my personality resonated with different types of people. I learned that my dry humor worked well in text messages, that my technical expertise made me interesting to women in various fields, that my stability and reliability were actually quite attractive to women who dated men who were exciting but unreliable. I also learned to recognize red flags that I'd ignored during my relationship with Rachel. Women who immediately started suggesting changes to my appearance or lifestyle, who complained about my communication style or social preferences, who seemed more interested in my potential than my present reality. I developed enough self-respect to end conversations with matches who exhibited those warning signs. The most valuable discovery was that compatibility wasn't about finding someone who would accept my flaws despite better options. It was about finding someone whose preferences aligned with my strengths, whose personality complemented mine, whose life goals were compatible with my own. I didn't need to become a different person to find love. I needed to find someone who appreciated the person I already was. My profile views and match rates continued climbing throughout the second month. I updated my photos with more recent pictures that showed me looking confident and relaxed. I refined my profile text based on which elements seemed to generate the most positive responses. I developed a more sophisticated understanding of how to initiate conversations that led to meaningful connections rather than polite exchanges that faded quickly. The women I was matching with were genuinely impressive. Doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, artists, teachers, researchers. Accomplished professionals who had their own careers, their own social circles, their own ambitions and interests. They weren't looking for someone to complete them or solve their problems. They were looking for someone to complement their already fulfilling lives. This was the dating market Rachel had warned me about, filled with women who had high standards and numerous options. But instead of finding it intimidating, I found it exciting. These women were choosing to spend their time getting to know me despite having plenty of alternatives. Their interest felt genuine because it was selective. I started to realize that Rachel's warnings about the dating market had been projections of her own insecurities rather than objective assessments of my prospects. She'd assumed that other women would see me the same way she'd learned to see me, as someone who needed improvement rather than appreciation. But her perspective had been shaped by years of disappointment in our relationship, not by an accurate understanding of my appeal to other people. The more successful matches I had, the more I understood that Rachel and I had simply been incompatible in ways that had nothing to do with my worth as a partner. She needed someone more extroverted, more status-conscious, more focused on external validation. I needed someone who appreciated introspection, valued substance over appearance, and understood that success could be measured in multiple ways. Instead of feeling bitter about the years I'd spent trying to become the man she wanted, I felt grateful for the lessons those experiences had taught me about recognizing incompatibility early and maintaining my sense of self within relationships. My marriage to Rachel had been an expensive education in understanding my own needs and boundaries. By the time I'd been on the apps for 6 weeks, I'd been on dates with 12 different women, had ongoing conversations with several others, and had developed enough experience to navigate the process with genuine confidence rather than artificial bravado. I was no longer trying to prove that I was worthy of attention. I was simply enjoying meeting new people and seeing where those connections might lead. The transformation wasn't just about dating success, it was about reclaiming my understanding of my own value and potential. Rachel had spent years convincing me that I was fundamentally flawed, that my natural personality was a liability, that my ambitions were insufficient. The evidence from dozens of positive interactions with other women suggested that her assessment had been wrong. I wasn't perfect, and I wasn't trying to be. But I was interesting, kind, intelligent, stable, and emotionally available. For many women, those qualities were exactly what they were looking for. Rachel's inability to appreciate those qualities said more about our incompatibility than my inadequacy as a partner. The notifications on my phone had become a source of genuine pleasure rather than anxiety. New matches, thoughtful messages, suggestions for interesting dates. Each interaction reinforced the growing understanding that I had more to offer than Rachel had ever acknowledged. What I couldn't have predicted was that my increasing confidence and social success would eventually reach Rachel through the complicated network of mutual friends and social media connections that persists even after divorce. The digital age makes it nearly impossible to completely separate from someone's orbit, especially when you've shared a life for several years. The first hint that Rachel was aware of my dating activity came through her sister Emma, who'd remained friendly with me despite the divorce. Emma had always been more diplomatic than Rachel, capable of maintaining relationships without taking sides in other people's conflicts. She'd occasionally texted me to check how I was adjusting to single life, conversations that felt genuinely caring rather than obligatory. During one of these check-ins, Emma mentioned that Rachel seemed to be struggling with some aspects of her own transition to single life. She'd joined the same dating apps I was using but was finding the experience more challenging than she'd anticipated. According to Emma, Rachel was frustrated by the quality of matches she was getting and the level of effort required to maintain interesting conversations. Emma's tone was carefully neutral, but I could read between the lines. Rachel had expected to find dating easier than I would, but reality wasn't matching her predictions. The confidence she'd shown while dismantling our marriage was being tested by interactions with strangers who didn't share her assessment of her desirability or my limitations. I felt a moment of satisfaction at this news, but it was quickly replaced by something more complex. I didn't want Rachel to suffer, but I was relieved that her confident predictions about our respective futures had been overly simplistic. The dating world was more complicated than either of us had understood while we were married. A few days later, Emma sent me a text that was more direct than her usual diplomatic communications. She said Rachel had asked her whether I was seeing anyone, and Emma had mentioned that I seemed to be doing well socially. She warned me that Rachel might try to contact me directly, not because she wanted to reconcile, but because she was curious about how I was managing the single life she'd predicted would be difficult for me. I appreciated the heads up, though I wasn't sure how I'd respond if Rachel did reach out. Part of me wanted to share my success as validation that her assessment of my romantic prospects had been wrong. But a larger part of me recognized that my dating life was none of her business, and that engaging with her curiosity would only create unnecessary drama. The contact came sooner than I'd expected, and through a channel I hadn't predicted. Instead of calling or texting directly, Rachel sent me a friend request on Instagram, a platform I rarely used but had started updating more regularly since rebuilding my social confidence. My Instagram feed had gradually filled with photos from my various dates and social activities. Coffee shops with Sarah, hiking trails with Jennifer, networking events with Monica, group dinners with colleagues who'd become genuine friends. Nothing inappropriate or boastful, just evidence of an active, fulfilling social life. I let the friend request sit unanswered for several days while I decided how to respond. Accepting it would give Rachel access to visual proof of my dating success, which might satisfy my ego but could also create unnecessary complications. Rejecting it would send a clear message about boundaries but might also seem petty or defensive. Before I could decide, Rachel solved the problem for me by withdrawing the friend request and sending me a direct message instead. The message was casual in tone, but loaded with subtext. She said she'd heard through mutual friends that I was doing well and wondered if we could have coffee to catch up, just as friends who'd shared an important part of their lives together. The invitation felt like a trap, though I couldn't identify exactly what kind. Rachel had been very clear about wanting a clean break, about moving forward separately, about not maintaining contact beyond the necessary legal communications. This sudden interest in my well-being felt inconsistent with the woman who'd methodically divided our possessions and walked away without looking back. I showed the message to Sarah, who'd become my primary dating focus over the previous few weeks. We developed the kind of comfortable intimacy that allows for honest conversations about complicated situations. She read the message carefully and asked what I thought Rachel's motivation might be. When I explained the context of our divorce and Rachel's predictions about my dating prospects, Sarah laughed in a way that wasn't entirely kind. She said it sounded like Rachel was discovering that her assumptions about the dating market had been wrong, and was now curious about how her supposedly hopeless ex-husband was managing to thrive in the same environment where she was struggling. Sarah's analysis felt accurate, but it also highlighted the potential dangers of engaging with Rachel's curiosity. Any response I gave would either satisfy her need for information or create opportunities for her to undermine my confidence again. There was no version of that coffee meeting that would benefit me more than it would benefit her. I decided to respond politely but firmly. I thanked her for the invitation, but explained that I preferred to keep our contact limited to necessary practical matters. I wished her well in her own transition to single life, but made it clear that I wasn't interested in maintaining a friendship. Her response came within minutes and revealed more about her state of mind than she probably intended. She said she understood my preference for distance, but hoped I wasn't letting bitterness prevent us from having a mature adult relationship. She added that she'd heard I was dating and wanted to make sure I was being realistic about long-term prospects versus short-term validation. That last line confirmed Sarah's analysis. Rachel wasn't interested in my well-being or our potential friendship. She was bothered by reports of my social success and wanted to reassert her authority as the expert on my limitations. The woman who'd warned me about my dating prospects was now trying to minimize evidence that those warnings had been wrong. I didn't respond to her follow-up message, but I screenshot it and sent it to Emma with a brief explanation. If Rachel was going to continue trying to undermine my confidence through indirect channels, I wanted at least one family member to understand the pattern. Emma's response was immediate and illuminating. She said Rachel had been complaining for weeks about the poor quality of men on dating apps, about how difficult it was to find someone who met her standards, about how differently the apps seemed to work for men versus women. According to Emma, Rachel seemed genuinely surprised that dating as a successful woman in her 30s was more challenging than she'd anticipated. Emma also mentioned that Rachel had asked several pointed questions about my dating life, questions that went beyond casual curiosity. She wanted to know if I was in a serious relationship, what kinds of women I was meeting, whether I seemed genuinely happy, or just putting on an act for social media. The pattern was becoming clear. Rachel had expected our post-divorce lives to unfold according to her predictions. I would struggle to find meaningful connections and eventually realize what I'd lost. She would thrive in a dating market that offered her numerous options and better matches than her previous husband. When reality didn't match those expectations, she'd become increasingly curious about how I was apparently succeeding where she was struggling. Part of me felt vindicated by this development, but a larger part felt relieved that I'd avoided the coffee meeting she'd suggested. Any interaction with Rachel at this point would have been about her need to understand and potentially undermine my success, rather than genuine interest in my well-being. The final confirmation of Rachel's mindset came through an unexpected source. One of my dating app matches, a woman named Lisa who worked in marketing, mentioned during our first phone conversation that she'd had a strange interaction with another woman on one of the apps. This woman had somehow found Lisa's profile and sent her unsolicited messages asking about her experience dating recently divorced men. Lisa had found the messages odd enough to take screenshots, partly because the woman seemed to be fishing for specific information rather than offering genuine advice. When Lisa described the woman's profile photo, I recognized Rachel immediately. The realization that Rachel was actively investigating my dating life through contact with my matches was both disturbing and revealing. She wasn't just curious about my general success on the apps. She was trying to understand specifically what kinds of women were interested in me and why those relationships might be working when hers apparently weren't. I warned Lisa about the situation and suggested she block any further contact from that profile. I also started being more careful about privacy settings and personal information sharing on the dating platforms. If Rachel was willing to contact my matches directly, there was no telling how far her investigation might extend. The incident with Lisa made me realize that Rachel's struggle with our role reversal was more intense than I'd understood. She'd built her post-divorce identity around being the more desirable partner who'd traded up by leaving me. Evidence that I was thriving while she was struggling threatened that narrative in ways that had apparently driven her to some questionable behavior. I decided to have a frank conversation with Emma about the pattern I was seeing. When I explained about Rachel's attempts to contact me, her messages to my dating matches, and her apparent obsession with monitoring my social life, Emma was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she admitted that Rachel had been asking increasingly specific questions about me, questions that had made Emma uncomfortable. Rachel wanted to know if I seemed genuinely happy or just pretending, whether my social media posts were authentic or staged, whether the women I was dating were actually attractive or just desperate. Emma said she'd started deflecting Rachel's questions because they seemed unhealthy and invasive. She was worried that Rachel was having trouble moving on, not because she wanted to reconcile, but because she couldn't accept that her predictions about our respective futures had been wrong. The conversation with Emma helped me understand that Rachel's behavior wasn't really about me. It was about her own struggle to reconcile her self-image with the reality of her post-divorce experience. She'd expected to feel liberated and sought after. Instead, she was discovering that being a successful woman in her 30s came with its own dating challenges. Rather than examining her own expectations or adjusting her approach, she was focusing on my apparent success as evidence that something was wrong with the dating market itself. If someone she considered fundamentally flawed was thriving while she was struggling, then the system must be broken rather than her assumptions being incorrect. Understanding Rachel's psychology helped me feel less personally targeted by her behavior, but it also made me more determined to maintain clear boundaries. Her inability to move on gracefully wasn't my problem to solve, and her need to understand my success wasn't my responsibility to satisfy. The situation reached its climax when Rachel made one final attempt to insert herself into my social life. She showed up unannounced at a restaurant where I was having dinner with Sarah, claiming she just happened to be in the area and had seen us through the window. The coincidence was transparently fake. The restaurant was across town from Rachel's apartment and workplace, in a neighborhood she'd never shown any interest in during our marriage. She'd clearly been monitoring my social media posts closely enough to know where I'd be on a specific evening. Her approach to our table was confident, almost aggressive. She introduced herself to Sarah as my ex-wife and mentioned that she'd been hoping to meet the women I was dating. She said this as if she had some natural right to approve or evaluate my romantic choices. Sarah handled the intrusion with impressive grace, acknowledging Rachel politely, but making it clear that she wasn't intimidated or impressed by the surprise introduction. When Rachel lingered at our table and tried to engage in conversation about our relationship, Sarah simply said she preferred to keep her focus on getting to know me rather than discussing my past. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but it revealed everything about the dynamic Rachel was trying to establish. She wanted to position herself as the authority on my romantic value, the expert who could warn other women about my limitations or validate their choices. She expected Sarah to be curious about her perspective or intimidated by her appearance. Instead, Sarah's polite but firm disinterest made it clear that Rachel's opinion was irrelevant to our developing relationship. The woman I was dating wasn't seeking approval from my ex-wife or looking for warnings about my character. She was forming her own opinions based on her own experiences. After Rachel finally left our table, Sarah and I had a conversation that crystallized everything I'd learned about my worth and potential. She said she could see why our marriage had failed, not because of my limitations, but because we were fundamentally incompatible people who'd brought out the worst in each other. Sarah's perspective helped me understand that Rachel's behavior wasn't evidence of my inadequacy or her superiority. It was evidence of someone struggling to adjust her self-concept when reality contradicted her expectations. The woman who'd confidently predicted my romantic struggles was now confronting evidence that those predictions had been wrong. The confrontation at the restaurant was Rachel's final attempt to reassert control over the narrative of our divorce. When that failed, she finally seemed to accept that my post-divorce life was none of her business and that her opinions about my prospects were no longer relevant to my reality. The weeks following Rachel's restaurant ambush brought an unexpected piece to my life. Her confrontation with Sarah had backfired spectacularly, serving only to highlight the contrast between her invasive behavior and the healthy boundaries I was learning to establish in new relationships. Instead of undermining my confidence or sabotaging my dating life, her actions had actually strengthened my resolve to protect the progress I'd made. Sarah and I talked extensively about the incident over the following days. Her reaction to Rachel's interruption had been telling, not just about her character, but about how dramatically my taste in partners had evolved. Where Rachel would have expected drama, jealousy, or insecurity, Sarah had responded with calm confidence and clear boundaries. She wasn't threatened by my ex-wife's opinion because she was forming her own assessment based on direct experience. The conversation revealed something important about the kind of relationship I was building with Sarah versus what I'd had with Rachel. Sarah was secure enough in herself that she didn't need to diminish other people to feel valuable. She didn't require constant reassurance about her importance in my life or validation that she was better than previous partners. Her self-worth came from internal sources rather than external comparisons. This security created space for our relationship to develop naturally, without the performative pressure that had characterized my marriage. I didn't feel like I was auditioning for the role of worthy partner or constantly proving that I deserved her attention. Instead, we were two complete people choosing to share experiences and see where compatibility might lead us. The contrast became even clearer when Emma called to apologize for Rachel's behavior. She'd learned about the restaurant incident through Rachel herself, who'd apparently described it as a chance encounter that had gone unexpectedly well. According to Rachel's version, she and Sarah had connected immediately, and Sarah had expressed interest in learning more about my past relationships to better understand my needs. Emma had been skeptical of this narrative, particularly when Rachel started suggesting that Sarah seemed like exactly the kind of woman who would appreciate her insights about my personality. When Emma pressed for details, Rachel's story had shifted in small but revealing ways, ultimately making it clear that the encounter had been planned rather than accidental. The fact that Rachel was still discussing my dating life with family members several weeks after our divorce was finalized concerned Emma. She worried that Rachel was struggling to establish her own post-divorce identity and was using her knowledge of my situation as a way to maintain relevance in conversations about relationships and dating. Emma's perspective helped me understand that Rachel's behavior wasn't really about me personally. It was about her difficulty accepting that the narrative she'd constructed about our divorce wasn't playing out according to her predictions. She'd positioned herself as the successful partner who'd recognized my limitations and moved on to better options. My apparent thriving threatened that story in ways that had led to increasingly inappropriate behavior. Understanding Rachel's psychology didn't excuse her actions, but it did help me respond with boundaries rather than anger. When she sent me another message a few days later, asking if we could have lunch to discuss something important regarding our shared financial accounts, I forwarded the message to my lawyer before responding. My attorney confirmed that all financial matters had been resolved in our divorce decree and that there were no shared accounts or obligations requiring ongoing communication. She advised me to respond with a brief message directing Rachel to contact my lawyer if she had any legitimate legal concerns and to document any future attempts at unnecessary contact. Rachel's response to this boundary was revealing. Instead of accepting that our financial matters were settled, she accused me of being unnecessarily hostile and legalistic about what should be simple adult communication. She suggested that my new relationship was making me paranoid and defensive, and that Sarah was probably encouraging me to cut ties with people who knew me well enough to offer honest perspectives. The projection in her message was almost comical. She was describing her own behavior while attributing it to others. Her attempts to insert herself into my current relationship, her monitoring of my social media, her contact with my dating matches, and her ambush at the restaurant were all examples of the paranoid and defensive behavior she was now claiming to see in me. I didn't respond to her accusations, but I did share them with Sarah as part of our ongoing conversations about healthy relationship dynamics. Sarah's reaction was educational for both of us. She pointed out that Rachel's message contained several manipulation tactics designed to make me question my own perceptions and decisions. By suggesting that my boundaries were evidence of hostility rather than self-protection, Rachel was trying to reframe my healthy behavior as problematic. By claiming that Sarah was influencing my responses, she was attempting to create tension between us while positioning herself as someone who knew me better than my current partner. Sarah's ability to identify and articulate these patterns helped me understand how systematically Rachel had undermined my confidence during our marriage. The criticism, the reframing of my positive qualities as problems, the suggestion that other people's perspectives were more valid than my own experiences had all been components of a dynamic that kept me dependent on her approval. The education I was getting about manipulation tactics through my relationship with Sarah was invaluable, but it also highlighted how much damage Rachel had done to my ability to trust my own judgment. I'd spent years second-guessing my instincts and accepting other people's assessments of my character and capabilities. Rebuilding that trust was an ongoing process that extended beyond dating into other areas of my life. At work, I was learning to advocate for my ideas more confidently and to push back against suggestions that didn't align with my expertise. In social situations, I was expressing my preferences more clearly instead of defaulting to whatever others wanted to do. The promotion I'd received had come with increased responsibilities that were testing my leadership abilities in ways I'd never experienced. Instead of approaching these challenges with the self-doubt Rachel had cultivated, I was tackling them with curiosity and confidence. When I didn't know something, I asked questions. When I disagreed with proposed solutions, I offered alternatives. When I succeeded, I accepted credit rather than attributing it to luck or other people's contributions. My colleagues had noticed the change in my professional demeanor. Carlos mentioned that I seemed more decisive in meetings and more willing to take risks on innovative approaches. Junior developers told me I was more approachable as a mentor because I seemed more comfortable with my own expertise. The feedback loop was positive and reinforcing. The more confident I became in my professional abilities, the more successful I became in leadership situations. The more successful I became, the more evidence I accumulated that Rachel's assessment of my potential had been wrong. This professional growth was happening parallel to my personal development through dating and my relationship with Sarah. Both areas of my life were providing evidence that I had more to offer than Rachel had ever acknowledged. The man she'd described as lacking ambition and leadership potential was thriving in management responsibilities. The partner she'd predicted would struggle to find meaningful connections was building a relationship with an impressive woman who appreciated his qualities. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. Rachel had spent our final months together criticizing my lack of ambition and social skills. Her attempts to undermine my post-divorce confidence had actually motivated me to develop both areas more aggressively than I might have otherwise. Her prediction that I'd struggle had become a challenge I was determined to disprove. But the real victory wasn't proving Rachel wrong. It was discovering that her opinion of my potential had been irrelevant to my actual capabilities. I didn't need her validation or approval to succeed professionally or personally. Her assessment of my worth had been distorted by her own dissatisfaction with our relationship, not based on objective evaluation of my character or abilities. The final chapter of my interaction with Rachel came through an unexpected source. One of her coworkers reached out to me through LinkedIn with a message that was both professional and personal. She explained that she worked in Rachel's department and had heard about our divorce through office conversations. The coworker, whose name was Patricia, said she was contacting me because Rachel's behavior at work had become concerning. She'd been sharing details about our divorce and my dating life with colleagues, presenting herself as an expert on relationship dynamics while making disparaging comments about my character and prospects. According to Patricia, Rachel had shown coworkers screenshots of my dating profiles and social media posts, asking for their opinions about the women I was dating and whether they seemed like appropriate matches for someone with my limitations. She'd been treating my personal life as entertainment for office gossip while positioning herself as the authority on my romantic value. Patricia was reaching out because she found this behavior unprofessional and potentially problematic for Rachel's career. She wanted to warn me that my private information was being shared in professional settings, and she also wanted to suggest that Rachel might benefit from some boundaries or intervention from management. The message from Patricia was disturbing on multiple levels. Rachel wasn't just monitoring my dating life out of personal curiosity. She was using it as content for workplace entertainment. She was sharing intimate details about our marriage and divorce with people who had no legitimate interest in that information. She was presenting herself as an expert on relationships, while simultaneously demonstrating remarkably poor judgment about appropriate boundaries. I thanked Patricia for the information and asked if she thought Rachel's behavior was affecting her work performance or creating problems for other colleagues. Patricia said it was primarily creating discomfort for people who didn't want to be involved in personal drama, but that it was also reflecting poorly on Rachel's professionalism and judgment. The situation put me in a difficult position. I had no desire to interfere with Rachel's career or create problems for her at work. But her use of my private information for office gossip was crossing lines that couldn't be ignored. After consulting with my attorney, I decided to send Rachel one final message through email, with my lawyer copied on the communication. The message was brief and formal, I informed Rachel that I'd learned she was sharing private information about me and my personal life with her coworkers. I reminded her that our divorce decree included confidentiality provisions about financial and personal matters. I requested that she cease all discussion of my private life in professional or social settings, and I warned that continued violations of these boundaries would result in legal action. I also informed her that I was documenting all her attempts to contact me, monitor my social media, and interfere with my dating relationships. I made it clear that any future contact should be limited to legitimate legal matters and should be directed through our attorneys. Rachel's response came within hours and revealed the extent of her anger and frustration. She accused me of being vindictive and controlling, of trying to silence her right to discuss her own experiences with divorce and relationships. She claimed that her conversations with coworkers were about her own healing process, not about damaging my reputation. The response also contained threats about her own potential legal action. She suggested that my dating profile contained false information about our marriage, that my social media posts were designed to make her look bad, and that my success with other women was somehow fraudulent or manipulative. Reading her message, I realized that Rachel had constructed an alternate reality in which she was the victim of my post-divorce behavior rather than the perpetrator of inappropriate boundary violations. She'd convinced herself that sharing my private information was justified self-expression and that my success was somehow illegitimate or harmful to her interests. My attorney's response to Rachel was swift and comprehensive. She outlined the specific legal violations Rachel was committing through her behavior, referenced relevant statutes about privacy and harassment, and provided a timeline for cessation of all inappropriate contact. She also mentioned that we had documentation of Rachel's attempts to interfere with my dating relationships and professional reputation. The legal response apparently had the desired effect. Within a week, Patricia sent me another LinkedIn message confirming that Rachel had stopped discussing my personal life at work. She'd also apparently removed me from all her social media platforms and had asked colleagues not to share information about my activities with her. The silence that followed was profound and welcome. For the first time since our divorce, I could focus on my own life without worrying about Rachel's monitoring or interference. My relationship with Sarah continued developing naturally, without external pressure or manipulation. My professional responsibilities expanded without self-doubt or second-guessing. 6 months after Rachel had packed her bags with the confident prediction that I'd never find anyone better, I was living a life that exceeded even my own expectations. The promotion had led to opportunities I'd never imagined. The relationship with Sarah had evolved into something deeper and more satisfying than anything I'd experienced during my marriage. Sarah and I had moved in together after dating for 4 months, a decision that felt natural and exciting rather than obligatory or pressured. She brought her own furniture, her own books, her own perspective on how shared spaces should function. Instead of one person's vision dominating the other's preferences, we'd created a home that reflected both our personalities and priorities. The contrast with my marriage to Rachel was stark. Where Rachel had treated cohabitation as an opportunity to improve my lifestyle and personality, Sarah saw it as a chance to blend our individual strengths into something collaborative. She appreciated my technical problem-solving abilities and my preference for quiet evenings. I admired her social confidence and her ability to find humor in stressful situations. We complemented each other without trying to change each other. When differences arose, we negotiated solutions rather than one person accepting criticism from the other. When we disagreed about decisions, we discussed options rather than one person's preferences automatically taking precedence. The healthy relationship dynamic I was experiencing with Sarah helped me understand just how toxic my marriage to Rachel had become. I'd normalized constant criticism, accepted that my preferences were less important than hers, and internalized the belief that love required constant self-improvement to maintain the other person's interest. With Sarah, Love felt like acceptance and appreciation rather than conditional approval based on performance. She didn't need me to become a different person to deserve her affection. She chose to be with me because she enjoyed who I already was, not because she saw potential for who I might become. The professional success I was experiencing felt similarly authentic. My management responsibilities had expanded to include oversight of multiple development teams and strategic planning for major technology initiatives. The skills Rachel had claimed I lacked, leadership ability, strategic thinking, and effective communication, were proving to be strengths I'd simply never had the opportunity to develop fully. The feedback from my team and senior management was consistently positive. I was being considered for director-level positions that would have been unimaginable during my marriage when I'd accepted Rachel's assessment that I lacked executive potential. The transformation wasn't just about external success. It was about internal confidence and self-understanding. I'd learned to distinguish between constructive feedback that helped me grow and destructive criticism that undermined my confidence. I developed the ability to recognize when someone's assessment of my potential reflected their own limitations rather than objective evaluation of my capabilities. The dating apps that had initially felt like foreign territory had become tools for understanding my own appeal and preferences. I'd learned to present myself authentically rather than trying to compensate for perceived flaws. I discovered which qualities attracted compatible partners and which red flags indicated fundamental incompatibility. Most importantly, I'd learned that Rachel's prediction about my romantic prospects had been based on her own narrow perspective rather than accurate assessment of my appeal to other women. The qualities she'd found inadequate, my thoughtfulness, my stability, my preference for deep connections over superficial excitement, were exactly what many women were seeking in long-term partners. The women I'd met through dating apps were successful, intelligent, and attractive individuals who had their own careers, social circles, and life goals. They weren't desperate or settling for inadequate partners. They were choosing to spend time with me because they found me interesting, attractive, and compatible with their own needs and preferences. This realization had been perhaps the most valuable outcome of my post-divorce experience. I discovered that my worth as a partner wasn't dependent on one person's opinion, particularly someone who'd been fundamentally incompatible with my personality and values. Rachel's inability to appreciate my qualities said more about our mismatch than about my inadequacy. A year after our divorce was finalized, I received a wedding invitation that provided the final punctuation to our story. Rachel was marrying someone she'd apparently met shortly after our divorce, a marketing executive who fit the profile of ambitious, socially connected men she'd always claimed to prefer. The invitation was professionally designed and expensive, reflecting Rachel's attention to appearances and social status. The venue was upscale, the guest list apparently extensive, and the registry included items that suggested a lifestyle focused on impressing others rather than personal satisfaction. I felt no jealousy or regret about the news. Rachel had found someone who appreciated the qualities I'd never been able to fully value, just as I'd found someone who appreciated qualities she'd never been able to see. We'd both ended up in relationships that were better suited to our respective needs and preferences. Sarah's reaction to the wedding invitation was characteristically thoughtful. She pointed out that Rachel's quick transition to another serious relationship might explain some of her previous behavior toward me. If she'd been developing feelings for someone else while we were married, or had met her current partner shortly after leaving me, it might have been easier for her to justify our divorce by focusing on my limitations rather than acknowledging her own changing feelings. This perspective helped me release any remaining resentment about how our marriage had ended. Rachel might have handled the situation poorly, but she'd ultimately done both of us a favor by ending a relationship that wasn't working for either of us. Her methods had been hurtful, but her conclusion had been correct. I sent a polite decline to the wedding invitation and a gift from their registry. The gesture felt like closing a chapter rather than harboring grudges or avoiding acknowledgement of her happiness. Rachel deserved to find someone who appreciated her ambition and social energy, just as I deserved to find someone who appreciated my different strengths and preferences. 2 years after Rachel had confidently predicted I'd never find anyone better than her, I proposed to Sarah during a quiet weekend at a cabin we'd rented in the mountains. The proposal wasn't elaborate or public, but it was authentic to who we were as a couple. I'd learned that the right person doesn't need grand gestures to feel valued, just consistent appreciation and genuine commitment. Sarah said yes without hesitation, and we spent the rest of the weekend planning a life together that excited both of us. The conversation was collaborative, rather than one person's vision dominating the other's input. We discussed careers, family goals, travel plans, and financial priorities as equal partners with complementary perspectives. The engagement ring I'd chosen reflected what I'd learned about understanding someone else's preferences rather than projecting my own assumptions. Sarah had mentioned admiring vintage settings during casual conversations about jewelry, so I'd found an antique ring that matched her aesthetic without being ostentatious or impractical. Her reaction to the ring confirmed that I'd developed better skills at listening and observing than I'd possessed during my marriage. She loved the setting, the history behind the piece, and the thoughtfulness that had gone into selecting something specifically suited to her taste rather than generic romantic expectations. Planning our wedding became an exercise in the collaborative decision-making that characterized our relationship. We both had opinions about venues, guest lists, and ceremonial elements, but we negotiated differences through discussion rather than one person's preferences automatically taking precedence. The contrast with Rachel's elaborate wedding based on what I'd seen in social media posts Emma had shared was striking. Where Rachel's celebration seemed designed to impress others and establish social status, our wedding was focused on celebrating our commitment with people who genuinely cared about our happiness. The guest list included colleagues who'd become genuine friends, family members who'd supported both of us, and a few couples we'd met through shared interests rather than professional networking. The conversation at our reception was about relationships, careers, hobbies, and life experiences rather than impressive achievements or social positioning. My marriage to Sarah began with the confidence and self-understanding I developed through my post-divorce growth. I wasn't entering the relationship with the insecurities and self-doubt that had characterized my first marriage. I knew what I had to offer and what I needed from a partner. Sarah brought her own emotional maturity and relationship experience to our marriage. She'd learned from her own previous relationships about the importance of maintaining individual identity while building shared goals. She understood that successful partnerships required ongoing communication and mutual respect rather than one person changing to accommodate the other's preferences. Our marriage became a laboratory for applying everything we'd both learned about healthy relationship dynamics. We maintained individual friendships and interests while building shared experiences and traditions. We supported each other's career goals without sacrificing our own ambitions. We navigated disagreements through discussion and compromise rather than criticism and defensiveness. The professional success I'd achieved continued expanding throughout the early years of our marriage. I was promoted to Director of Engineering and later to Vice President of Technology Development. The leadership abilities Rachel had claimed I lacked became central to my career advancement and professional reputation. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize and develop my strengths rather than focusing on correcting perceived weaknesses. The management style I developed emphasized collaboration, clear communication, and strategic thinking rather than trying to emulate more extroverted or aggressive leadership approaches that didn't match my personality. My teams consistently delivered successful projects and reported high job satisfaction in company surveys. The technical expertise I'd always possessed became more valuable when combined with management skills and strategic vision. I'd learned to present my ideas effectively, advocate for necessary resources, and build consensus around innovative approaches. The success felt authentic because it was based on developing my natural abilities rather than trying to become someone fundamentally different. Rachel had been wrong about my potential, but she'd also been wrong about what success required. I didn't need to change my core personality to advance professionally. I needed to find environments and roles that valued my particular combination of skills and perspectives. 5 years after Rachel had dismissed my prospects with such confidence, I was living a life that exceeded every prediction she'd made about my limitations. The career she'd said I'd never advance in had become a source of recognition and financial success. The dating life she'd warned would be difficult had led to a marriage that was more satisfying and stable than anything we'd shared. The transformation hadn't required becoming a different person. It had required recognizing and developing the person I'd always been underneath the self-doubt and criticism I'd accepted during our relationship. Rachel's inability to appreciate my qualities had been about our incompatibility, not about my inadequacy. The most valuable lesson from the entire experience was learning to distinguish between constructive feedback that helped me grow and destructive criticism that undermined my confidence. Not all opinions about my potential were equally valid or valuable. Some people's assessments reflected their own limitations rather than accurate evaluation of my capabilities. Rachel had been wrong about my romantic prospects, my professional potential, and my ability to build a fulfilling life after our divorce. But she'd also been wrong about something more fundamental. She'd assumed that her opinion of my worth was more accurate and important than my own understanding of what I had to offer. The confidence I'd developed through success in dating, career advancement, and building a healthy marriage had taught me that my value wasn't dependent on any single person's approval or assessment. I was responsible for understanding and developing my own potential, not for accepting other people's limitations as facts about my capabilities. Looking back on the journey from Rachel's dismissive predictions to my current happiness, I felt grateful rather than bitter. She'd done me the favor of ending a relationship that wasn't working for either of us. Her confidence about my limited prospects had motivated me to prove those predictions wrong. Her attempts to undermine my post-divorce success had actually strengthened my resolve to protect and develop the progress I was making. The man she'd described as romantically hopeless had built a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility. The partner she'd predicted would struggle to find meaningful connections had attracted interest from numerous accomplished women who appreciated his qualities. The professional she'd claimed lacked leadership potential had advanced to executive positions through developing rather than abandoning his natural strengths. Rachel's prediction that I'd never find anyone better had been spectacularly wrong, but the real victory wasn't proving her wrong about my prospects. It was discovering that her assessment of my worth had been irrelevant to my actual potential all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.